Okay, I'm going to go through the steps to make up a set of frog points like these ones here. A set of frog points is made from two separate pieces of rail like this, and on the ends of these rail a very precise angle is filed, and that way when the two pieces get soldered together you're left with a frog point with the correct angle to match the turnout you're building. The process of preparing a set of frog points can be broken down into 5 steps. One is you cut the rails to length. 2 is file the angle on the end of the rails. Then you secure it into the fixture, flux and solder the two halves together, and then remove it from the fixture and clean up any excess solder that happens to be on the top of the rail. So cutting the rails to length sounds like a simple enough step, and it is, but there's a couple of key points that you need to remember. One is how long to cut the rail for each half of your frog point. What's important to remember here is that the fixtures are actually shorter than a full-length turnout. To get an idea how long a full-size turnout is, it's best to look at one of our laser cut quick sticks, because this includes all the ties of a complete turnout right down to where the cross ties diverge at the end of the turnout. And you can see by lining it up with the fixture that it's actually 1.5 inches or so longer, at least in HO scale. But in every scale, the full-length turnout will be slightly longer than the fixture. So when you cut your rails to length, you want to make sure that you're going to cut the rail long enough to build the entire turnout. So you want to be sure that it's going to stick out past the end of this, because if you leave it too short here, it's kind of awkward to join in to the rest of your track work. So to ensure you get that right, I like to take a quick stick, put it on the fixture, lining up the throw bar tie. This makes sure that the quick sticks are aligned with the turnout on the fixture. And then taking a length of rail, just eyeball that we have a piece that's long enough to go from the end of the frog and protrude out past the end of the quick sticks, and that's what I've got here. So I'll just mark that with my thumb and nip off a couple lengths of rail. You need 2 pieces. I'm just gonna snip off 2 here. And when you cut a piece of rail, make sure that you're paying attention. You don't leave a mashed over piece on the end like this. You want to clean that up. You want nice sharp ends on the rail like that. So there's our 2 pieces of rail for our frog point. So next we're going to file an angle on the end of these pieces of rail for our frog. And the most precise way to do that is to use one of our PointForm tools here. They can also be done by hand, but it can be very tricky to get the angles precise, and that's key to getting a smooth running turnout, is to end up with frog points that are nice and sharp and very precisely formed, and that's what this tool does very well. So I'm not going to go into complete detail on the process of filing using our PointForm tool. There's a separate video for that covers it in a lot more detail. So I'll just quick file these off here. Alright, our points are nicely filed and ready to solder together. Now what we're doing is actually going to solder the 2 halves of the rail together to form a frog point like this, and then we're going to set that aside till later in the build, because we don't need it till almost the very end of the turnout construction. I like to do that, that way we can place them into the fixture as a solid piece and adjust their location so it runs really nice and smooth, testing it with a set of wheels. So then it's easier to do that if they're soldered together as opposed to doing it with 2 separate pieces of rail. And we can use the fixture as a soldering jig to hold the pieces while we solder. It doesn't matter which side of the fixture you use, the left hand or the right hand, because the frog points, the frog points are symmetrical, so we can use either side. So you just take the 2 halves of the rail, drop them into the grooves like this, and then slide them forward. And we slide them forward equally until they just touch, like that, there. And we put them together symmetrically, so we don't have one rail isn't setting ahead of the other like this. They're actually designed to go together like that. And you just slide them in till they touch. You don't want to push too hard, otherwise they'll fall over. So just in like that. And we need to hold them steady while we solder them in place. There's a couple of ways to do that. The simplest being just take the PointForm tool and set it on the rails like that, and it'll hold it while we work on it. But in some of the smaller fixtures, in the smaller scales, it can be hard to get the PointForm on there because there's not a lot of space on there. So what I like to do in that situation is to tape them down, and I'll show you what I mean. This is a number 6 N in 3s. You can see how much smaller this one is. And here are 2 frog point rails. When I put them in the fixture, like so, there's not a whole lot of room here to hold it in place with the PointForm tool. As you can see, it kind of covers the whole thing up. So an easier solution to that is to grab a small piece of tape like this. This is just some 1/4 inch wide painter's tape. Get the rails in the correct position, and then we just drop a piece of tape on it like that, making sure we get the tape on the fixture and on the rails. That way it holds it nice and stable. And now we can work. So back to our the one we're actually working on, and we can do the same thing with this. We can take a piece of tape and just tape it on like so there, and that's going to hold that nice and stable while we solder the two rails of our frog point together. Another alternative, if you just can't make this work, is to use what we call our frog helper tool, and that's this here. They have very precisely machined grooves on them to hold the rail at the specific angle for the turnout you're building. This one here will do a number 4 or 5 or a 6 turnout. And you just take the rails, drop them into the tool like this, line up the ends, and then solder it together. And the advantage of this tool, there's a couple of things. One is it's a lot longer, so the rail is more stable. Lots of room to put a weight on it. You can still use tape on it. The other one is that there's clearance underneath the rail, so when you're soldering, it's a little bit easier to solder because it won't act as a heat sink. Okay, with our rails securely in place in the fixture, we're ready to put a little bit of flux on here, and we'll solder the two halves together. It doesn't take a whole lot of flux, just a little bit across the top of the rail. Unlike most of the soldering you're going to be doing in this fixture, we're actually soldering from the top of the rail where we're going to solder these two halves together. Most of the time you're going to be soldering the rail to PC board ties. But the process is pretty straightforward. We just want to apply some heat to the top of the rail like that, and as soon as we apply heat, you almost immediately see the flux start to melt, and that's good. That's exactly what it's supposed to be doing. And we're just going to touch the solder to the tip of the iron, and it'll start to melt. You can see how that's flowing already nicely in there. And just work them back and forth. And we're going to leave the heat on there for quite a while, just to make sure that the solder is flowing down in between those two pieces of rail, like this. There we go. I've actually got a video where I cover soldering in a lot more detail, and I'd recommend that you watch that before going too far in the turnout build. But you can see here how nicely that solder's melting and flowing down in there. I'm just leaving the heat on there, nice and long. There we go. And that's done. Okay, I'm going to give this an inspection, see how it looks. I'm quite happy with it. You can see that the solder has flowed down all the way between the pieces of rail. It's actually showing up on the bottom a little bit here, and that's good. That means that we got a really nice solid solder joint. Now you can see that there's a lot of solder on the top of the rail, and we're going to clean that off with a file, just using the same file we use to file the frog points. When we file this, we want to make sure that we're filing nice and flat across the top like this. You don't want to file on an angle because you can round over the end of our frog point and it'll affect the way that it runs. So I'm just lightly skimming the top of the rail just to take off the excess solder like that. I don't want to remove any of the rail, just the solder. There we go. Now we got a pretty nice solder, or a pretty nice frog point here. Later on in our build, we'll actually polish this rail a little bit with some fine sandpaper to get those scratches out. But for now, we've got one good quality frog point.